the silent move that triggers the avoidant's worst emotional collapse. Have you ever pulled back from someone just for your own clarity, only to watch them unravel in ways they swore they never would? There's a moment, quiet and subtle, when your absence says more to an avoidant partner than your presence ever could. And that moment becomes the trigger for their deepest emotional spiral, even if they'll never admit it. There's a move in relationships that doesn't require raised voices, emotional manipulation, or dramatic exits. It's simply this: you stop chasing, not in a punishing way, not to prove a point, but because you've finally chosen peace over pursuit. And for an avoidant person, this is the moment their internal world starts to shake. Avoidant individuals rely on a predictable pattern. They pull away, you reach out, they retreat, you close the distance, they erase certainty, you write it back in. It's a dance built on imbalance, and they count on you not to change the steps. But when you stop chasing, when you stop filling in the emotional gaps, when you stop being the safety net they never appreciated, suddenly their emotional logic collapses. They expected freedom. What they experience is fear. Not fear of you leaving, fear of the silence revealing what they actually feel. Because in your quiet withdrawal, they lose the reassurance that you'll always carry the emotional load. This is where their collapse begins. They start to question why your energy shifted. They wonder if someone else is giving you the connection they avoided. They feel a loss of control over a dynamic they thought was fixed. And they finally face the truth that your presence wasn't guaranteed. It was a privilege. The silent move wasn't about punishing them. It was about honoring yourself. And ironically, that self-honoring is the one thing that forces the avoidant to confront the emotions they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Because when you stop chasing, they can no longer hide behind the idea that you'll always be there. The collapse isn't loud, it's internal. And it's the first time they realize that distance doesn't protect them, it isolates them. If they want real connection, they'll have to do the one thing they've been running from: step forward. The silent move begins long before the avoidant notices anything has shifted. It starts in you, when you finally reach that quiet moment of truth, where you recognize that continuing to chase someone who keeps distancing themselves is costing you more than the connection is giving back. It's not an act of rebellion, not a tactic, and not a punishment. It's simply the moment you choose to stop running after someone who won't turn around. And because it's born from clarity rather than anger, its impact is far more powerful than any emotional outburst could ever be. When you withdraw your pursuit, the energy of the dynamic changes instantly. You stop over-explaining your feelings, stop trying to predict their moods, stop sending messages just to keep things alive, stop offering reassurance they haven't earned. You're no longer trying to close the distance they constantly create. You're not matching their silence with desperation, nor are you trying to decode what they meant by pulling away yet again. Instead, you return your focus to your own emotional balance, your own routine, your own peace. This shift is subtle, but for someone who has relied on you being the emotional anchor of the connection, it's deeply unsettling. Avoidant individuals often assume the other person will hold the emotional weight indefinitely. They expect that withdrawing affection or communication won't change anything because you've always been the one to keep the connection intact. So when you stop chasing, they feel something they rarely feel: uncertainty. They never planned for you to stop showing up. They never imagined a world in which you don't send the follow-up text, don't soften the tension, don't remind them of your interest. They don't know how to interpret a lack of pursuit because their entire pattern depends on your predictability. But your decision to pull back isn't about them. It's about self-respect. It's about recognizing that genuine connection can't exist if one person is always giving and the other is always retreating. It's about realizing that your worth isn't measured by how much emotional labor you can perform for someone else. And it's about choosing to invest energy where it's reciprocated, not where it's merely tolerated. This silent move isn't dramatic, it's intentional. It's quiet, but it's strong. And in many ways, it's the first time the avoidant is forced to see you not as a constant presence, but as someone with boundaries, self-awareness, and the courage to step back when your emotional needs are not being met. Avoidant individuals move through relationships with a kind of emotional rhythm that feels familiar and safe to them, even if it's deeply frustrating for the other person. Their pattern is built on creating distance whenever intimacy begins to feel too real, too close, or too demanding. When they retreat, they subconsciously expect the other person to compensate, to reach out, to soothe, to clarify, to fix the discomfort that the avoidant is trying to escape. Over time, this becomes the unspoken structure of the relationship. They pull away and you step forward. They withdraw emotionally and you rush in with reassurance. They go silent and you fill the silence. It's a loop that keeps them safe from vulnerability and keeps you in a constant state of emotional effort. This is why your decision to stop bridging the distance is so destabilizing for them. The shift doesn't match the script they've come to rely on. They're used to you noticing their withdrawal and reacting immediately, sending a heartfelt message, asking if they're okay, or trying to reconnect with warmth and understanding. They've learned that no matter how far they retreat, the emotional tether remains intact because you're the one holding it. When that tether suddenly slackens, they feel it in a way they cannot ignore. Your non-pursuit interrupts the dynamic they've depended on to regulate their emotional discomfort. Instead of feeling safely detached, they're confronted with a space they didn't expect. It's not just the absence of your words, it's the absence of your effort, your reassurance, your predictability. That predictability gave them permission to stay avoidant because they believed the connection wouldn't be lost. They believed you would always bridge the gap for both of you. When you stop chasing, it sends a message they didn't plan for. The distance they create doesn't guarantee safety. It can also create loss. And because avoidant individuals often struggle to identify or express their own emotional needs, your sudden shift exposes them to feelings they're not equipped to handle: uncertainty, insecurity, even jealousy. These feelings disrupt the protective emotional armor they rely on. They start wondering why you aren't closing the distance, whether your feelings have changed, whether someone else is offering you what they refuse to give. The very thing they thought would keep them safe, pulling away, now becomes the catalyst for their emotional unease. You didn't pressure them, confront them, or threaten them. You simply stopped doing the emotional labor they quietly relied on. And without your pursuit, their avoidance strategy doesn't function the way it used to. It collapses under its own weight, leaving them face to face with the reality that connection isn't sustainable if only one person is willing to move toward it. Your silence does something that no argument, no heartfelt confession, and no plea for clarity ever could. It forces the avoidant person to sit alone with their own emotions. And that's the one place they rarely, if ever, go willingly. Avoidant individuals are skilled at redirecting their discomfort outward. When they feel pressure or closeness, they instinctively focus on your intensity, your timing, your expectations. They analyze your behavior because it helps them avoid analyzing their own. But when you stop pursuing, when there's no message to decode, no emotional wave to brace against, they can no longer shift the spotlight onto you. The silence turns the focus inward, and for them, that is an unfamiliar and unsettling territory. In this space, they begin encountering emotions they've spent years training themselves to suppress. Feelings like longing, fear of loss, or uncertainty about their own value, emotions they've convinced themselves they're above, begin to surface. These emotions don't come in dramatic waves. They show up quietly: restlessness, intrusive thoughts about you, flashes of insecurity, curiosity mixed with anxiety about what you're thinking. Because the usual pattern of retreat followed by your reassurance is gone, their system doesn't know where to place these feelings. They can't dismiss them as reactions to your behavior because you've removed your behavior from the equation altogether. Suddenly, they're not managing you, they're managing themselves. And that is the emotional work they've tried to avoid through distance and detachment. They start wondering why your silence feels heavier than their own withdrawal ever felt. They start questioning whether they misread the connection, whether you were more significant to them than they allowed themselves to believe. This isn't just discomfort. It's the slow cracking of a defense system that has served them for years. Your silence also removes the emotional noise that allowed them to stay numb. When you were reaching out, they could frame the dynamic however they needed. You were too much, too available, too invested. That narrative protected them from feeling much at all. But now, with nothing to react to, they're left with their own raw inner landscape. It becomes harder for them to deny that they missed the closeness they pretended not to need. Harder to pretend they feel nothing when you're no longer feeding the connection. Harder to maintain the illusion of control when their emotions are doing things they didn't authorize. In your quiet withdrawal, they're forced to acknowledge that their feelings exist. Messy, inconvenient, and real. And there's no distraction, no justification, no external trigger they can use to escape those feelings. For perhaps the first time, they meet themselves emotionally without the shield of your effort to hide behind. When you stop doing the emotional work they've grown accustomed to, something shifts inside them that they never expected, the feeling of losing control. Avoidant individuals often create emotional distance not just to protect themselves, but to maintain a sense of power over the pace and depth of the connection. By pulling back first, they feel they're safeguarding themselves from vulnerability. They believe that if they keep you a step behind, always wondering, always reaching, they'll never have to face the possibility of being hurt or exposed. This distance isn't random, it's strategic, even if they don't consciously recognize it as such. But when you stop chasing, you interrupt that strategy. The dynamic they've relied on suddenly stops functioning the way it always has. They're no longer the ones dictating the rhythm. They're no longer the emotionally untouched party who gets to observe from a distance while you absorb all the uncertainty. Now the uncertainty belongs to them. They start to feel the very thing they thought distance would protect them from, the fear that something valuable might slip through their fingers. Your silence presents them with a form of unpredictability they never planned for. They expect that when they retreat, you will move forward. They assume your reassurance is automatic, that your interest is stable regardless of their inconsistency. But when you don't reach out, when you don't try to fix the disconnect, they lose a sense of emotional grounding. They can't rely on the familiar pattern to confirm their importance or to soothe their deeper insecurities. And these insecurities were always there, buried under their coping mechanisms. Losing your reassurance means losing the comfort of certainty. It also means losing the subtle validation they got from your consistent effort. They may act like your presence is optional, like your attention doesn't matter, but their internal world tells a different story. They feel a pang when you're no longer emotionally available. They notice the quiet, not because they want chaos or conflict, but because your effort always softened the consequences of their avoidance. Now, without your energy filling the gaps, the emptiness they created reflects back at them, and they finally have to sit with what that emptiness means. In this new dynamic, they can no longer pretend they hold all the power. The loss of control shows up in small but potent ways, wondering if you're thinking about them, feeling unsettled when you don't respond, imagining scenarios where someone else appreciates you in the ways they refuse to. They become aware that withdrawal isn't a guarantee of safety, it's a gamble that can lead to real loss. And that realization shakes the foundation of the emotional distance they once believed kept them secure. Your choice to step back isn't a punishment, it's a declaration of self-worth. And for an avoidant partner, this is where everything quietly shifts. When you stop chasing, you're no longer feeding the dynamic where they do less and you compensate more. You're showing through action rather than argument that you expect reciprocity, that your energy has value, and that connection isn't something you're willing to carry alone. This is the moment your behavior becomes a mirror, reflecting back to them the very imbalance they've been avoiding. In that reflection, something inside them begins to awaken. Avoidant individuals often move through relationships believing they can hide in the shadows of emotional distance. They assume that vulnerability is optional and that someone else will always take the risk for them. But your self-honoring shift interrupts that illusion. Suddenly, if they want the connection to continue, they have to participate. They have to reach out, initiate, express interest, show effort, steps that challenge the very patterns they've used for protection. This creates an internal conflict for them. The part of them that longs for closeness pushes forward, while the part that fears intimacy tries to pull back. Your silence intensifies this tension, leaving them with a choice they can no longer avoid. In the space you've created, they begin to realize that you weren't chasing them. You were connecting with them. And when that connection disappears, they feel the absence more deeply than they expect. It becomes clearer that your presence wasn't guaranteed, that the emotional safety you provided wasn't a given, but a gift. This awareness nudges them toward growth in a way confrontation never could. They start to see that distance doesn't eliminate emotional risk. It simply transfers all the risk onto the other person while keeping them stuck in their own limitations. Your withdrawal shows them the cost of staying avoidant, not through anger or demands, but through reality. If they continue to retreat, they don't just lose your messages or gestures. They lose access to a relationship where someone genuinely cared. They lose the softness, the understanding, the emotional availability they had begun to rely on. And to regain it, they must step into the vulnerability they've spent years avoiding. That challenge, though uncomfortable, is also an invitation. It offers them the chance to grow, to show up in ways they never have, and to build a connection founded on mutual effort rather than silent expectations. Your self-honoring move becomes the catalyst that forces them to question their patterns and decide whether they're willing to evolve. If they step forward, it's not because you pushed, it's because your silence revealed the truth. Real connection requires courage from both sides. When you finally stop chasing, you're not creating drama, you're creating clarity. Your silence becomes the moment of truth that no conversation ever could. It reveals what the avoidant has been running from, exposes the emotions they've buried, and forces them to confront the reality of losing something they never believed they could lose. Your choice to step back isn't about control. It's about reclaiming your energy, your dignity, and your emotional well-being. And in doing so, you become the catalyst for the avoidant's deepest internal shift. Whether they rise to meet you or retreat into old patterns is ultimately their responsibility, not your burden. Your quiet move is powerful not because it changes them, but because it honors you. It marks the moment you choose connection with yourself over the chaos of chasing someone who isn't ready to meet you halfway. Thank you for sharing your time and attention, and for being willing to explore the deeper layers of human connection. I appreciate you for showing up with curiosity, courage, and a desire to understand these emotional dynamics more clearly. Wherever you are in your own story, whether you're healing, growing, or making difficult decisions, I hope this message has given you clarity, strength, and a reminder of your worth. Take care of yourself, honor your boundaries, and remember, the right connections don't require you to shrink or chase. Thank you, and until next time, take care.